Captain Ruby Phillips watched through her Blackhawk's windscreen as 300 American soldiers fought desperately against overwhelming enemy forces 5 kilometers inside hostile territory, completely surrounded with no air support and no way out. But command had explicitly ordered all aircraft to hold position due to heavy anti-aircraft fire making extraction suicide. Ruby listened to Colonel David Harrison's increasingly desperate radio calls, reporting casualties mounting and ammunition running critically low. And she made a decision that would either save 300 lives or end her military career. She was taking her Blackhawk into that kill zone, regardless of orders, because sometimes the difference between following regulations and doing what's right is 300 soldiers who deserve a pilot willing to risk everything to bring them home. The mission had started as a standard reconnaissance and force operation. Colonel David Harrison's battalion, 300 soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division, had pushed into a contested border region to locate and assess enemy force concentrations that intelligence suggested were massing for a major offensive. The operation should have been straightforward: move through the area, gather intelligence, engage any enemy forces encountered, and withdraw before significant resistance could be organized. The battalion had armored support, artillery on call, and air assets available for both fire support and emergency extraction if needed. But intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about enemy strength and positioning. At 0800 hours, Harrison's battalion had advanced into what appeared to be lightly defended territory. By 0900 hours, they'd encountered their first enemy contact, a screening force that fell back after brief engagement. Standard tactics suggested the enemy was withdrawing to avoid decisive engagement. By 1000 hours, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The battalion had been deliberately drawn into a carefully prepared kill zone. Enemy forces, estimated at over 2,000 combatants with heavy weapons, armor, and prepared defensive positions, had allowed the Americans to penetrate deep into the territory, then closed the trap behind them. Harrison's 300 soldiers suddenly found themselves completely surrounded, 5 kilometers inside enemy-controlled territory, taking fire from all directions and facing an enemy force that outnumbered them nearly 7-1. Harrison immediately called for fire support and emergency extraction. Artillery began raining down on enemy positions, buying the battalion time to establish a defensive perimeter. But artillery alone wouldn't be enough. The enemy had too many forces, too much firepower, and complete control of the surrounding terrain. The battalion needed air support to break the encirclement. They needed helicopter gunships to destroy enemy armor and suppress heavy weapons. They needed transport helicopters to evacuate wounded and, if the situation continued deteriorating, to extract the entire battalion before they were overrun. But the enemy had prepared for that too. As soon as American helicopters approached the area, they encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire, surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, and concentrated small arms fire from hundreds of enemy fighters. 2 Apache gunships attempting to provide close air support had been forced to break off after taking damage. A medevac helicopter trying to extract wounded had been hit by a missile and barely made it back to friendly lines with severe damage. At 1100 hours, command made the decision that would seal the battalion's fate. All helicopter operations in the area were suspended until the anti-aircraft threat could be suppressed. It was a reasonable decision from a command perspective. Sending helicopters into that environment was suicide, and losing aircraft and crews wouldn't help the surrounded soldiers. But from the perspective of 300 soldiers fighting for survival, it was a death sentence. Captain Ruby Phillips had been monitoring the situation from Forward Operating Base Guardian, 20 kilometers from the surrounded battalion. She was part of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, flying a highly modified MH-60 Blackhawk configured for special operations support. Her Blackhawk was equipped with advanced avionics, enhanced defensive systems, upgraded engines for superior performance, and weapon systems that made it far more capable than standard transport helicopters. She'd flown hundreds of missions in hostile environments, specializing in the kind of high-risk operations that conventional aviation units wouldn't attempt. When she heard the order suspending helicopter operations to Harrison's surrounded battalion, Ruby immediately went to find her commander, Colonel Victoria Stone. "Ma'am, I'm hearing that we've suspended air operations to the surrounded battalion. Is that confirmed?" Stone looked up from the tactical display showing Harrison's deteriorating situation. "Confirmed. The anti-aircraft environment is too dangerous. We've already had 2 Apaches damaged and a medevac bird nearly shot down. We can't justify sending more aircraft into that kill zone until we can suppress the air defense threat." "How long until we can suppress it?" "Fixed-wing strikes are being coordinated, but with the enemy forces so close to our surrounded battalion, we're limited in what we can hit without risking friendly casualties. Estimate 4 to 6 hours before we can create a safe corridor for helicopter operations." Ruby looked at the tactical display showing Harrison's position. The enemy was closing in from all sides, pressing the attack, clearly intending to overrun the American position before relief could arrive. "Ma'am, with respect, that battalion doesn't have 4 to 6 hours. The enemy knows we can't provide air support right now. They're going to press their advantage and try to finish this before we can intervene." "I'm aware of that, Captain. But I'm not sending helicopters and crews into certain death. We've already lost too many aircraft today. My Black Hawk has enhanced defensive systems, missile warning receivers, infrared countermeasures, radar warning receivers. I've operated in high-threat environments before. I can get in there." Stone shook her head firmly. "Captain Phillips, I understand your desire to help those soldiers, but the answer is no. The risk is too high. We wait for the air defense suppression, then we go in with proper support. And if the battalion is overrun before then we'll have lost 300 soldiers, which would be a tragedy. But we won't compound that tragedy by losing helicopters and crews in a futile rescue attempt." Ruby wanted to argue further, but she could see the decision was final. She saluted and left the command post, her mind racing with calculations about range, fuel, defensive tactics, and whether one Black Hawk flown by a skilled pilot with the right approach could actually make it through that anti-aircraft gauntlet. Over the next hour, the situation continued deteriorating. Harrison's radio reports painted an increasingly desperate picture. Ammunition running critically low, wounded overwhelming the battalion's medical capabilities, enemy armor moving into assault positions, defensive perimeter shrinking under relentless pressure. At 12:15 hours, Harrison transmitted what sounded like a final situation report. "All stations, this is Ironside Actual. We are now surrounded on all sides, ammunition down to approximately 30 rounds per man, enemy armor positioning for final assault. We've held this position for 3 hours, but without immediate support. We will be overrun within the next hour. If any aircraft can reach us, now is the time. Ironside Actual out." Ruby stood in the hangar bay staring at her Black Hawk, listening to Harrison's transmission, and made her decision. Her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Tyler Bennett, walked up beside her. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" "Thinking about what?" "Going in anyway, ignoring the order and flying into that kill zone." Ruby didn't answer immediately. Finally, 300 soldiers, Tyler. 300 Americans who are going to die in the next hour unless someone helps them. We have a helicopter. We have the skills. We have defensive systems that give us a chance. We also have orders explicitly telling us not to go. Orders that exist because Command has determined the risk is too high. Command is 20 kilometers away looking at tactical displays. We're pilots who've operated in high-threat environments. We know what that Black Hawk can do. We know what we can do. Bennett was quiet for a moment. "If we do this, our careers are over." Disobeying direct orders, unauthorized flight into hostile territory, operating without mission approval, that's court-martial territory. "I know. So the question is, are 300 lives worth our careers?" Ruby turned to look at Bennett directly. "That's not really a question, is it?" Bennett smiled slightly. "No, I guess it's not." "When do we launch?" "As soon as we can get pre-flight complete and clearance to taxi." We'll request permission for a training flight, get airborne, then head for Harrison's position before anyone realizes what we're doing. They'll order us to return. Then we'll turn off our radios and claim communications failure. By the time they can physically stop us, we'll either be at Harrison's position or shot down trying to get there. 20 minutes later, Ruby and Bennett completed pre-flight checks on their Black Hawk. Ruby keyed the radio to the tower. Guardian Tower, this is Night Stalker 7-1 requesting clearance to taxi for local training flight. The tower controller responded routinely. Night Stalker 7-1, cleared to taxi to pad 3 for training departure. Ruby taxied the Black Hawk to the departure pad, went through final checks and keyed the radio again. Guardian Tower, Night Stalker 7-1, ready for departure. Night Stalker 7-1, cleared for departure, maintain training area boundaries, contact approach on button 4. Night Stalker 7-1, cleared for departure. Ruby pulled collective, applied power, and lifted the Black Hawk smoothly into hover. She transitioned to forward flight, climbing and accelerating away from the base. Once they were airborne and clear of the immediate base area, Bennett spoke quietly. Last chance to change your mind. Once we turn toward Harrison's position, we're committed. Ruby adjusted their heading, turning the Black Hawk directly toward the surrounded battalion's coordinates. 300 soldiers don't get a chance to change their minds about being surrounded. Let's go get them. For the first 5 minutes, the flight was routine. Then the radio crackled with the tower controller's voice. Night Stalker 7-1, be advised you are deviating from approved training area. Correct your heading immediately. Ruby didn't respond. Night Stalker 7-1, Guardian Tower, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge. Ruby reached down and switched off the radio. Communications failure, she said to Bennett. We can't hear them. Bennett grinned despite the tension. Convenient timing on that failure. The Black Hawk raced across the terrain at 140 knots, staying low to avoid enemy radar detection. Ruby flew with the instinctive precision of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in helicopters, reading the terrain, adjusting altitude to maximize cover, keeping the aircraft in constant motion to make it a difficult target. 10 minutes into the flight, Ruby's radar warning receiver began beeping. Enemy radar had detected them. Moments later, her missile warning system activated with urgent tone. Surface-to-air missile launch detected. Missile launch 3 o'clock, Bennett called out, tracking the threat on his displays. Ruby immediately broke hard right, diving toward the terrain while dispensing infrared flares to decoy the heat-seeking missile. The Black Hawk's enhanced engines and control systems allowed maneuvers that would have been impossible in a standard helicopter. The missile went for the flares, detonating harmlessly 200 meters away. Missile defeated, Bennett reported, but they know we're here now. How far to Harrison's position? 12 kilometers, 7 minutes at current speed. 7 minutes that would be the longest of Ruby's career. The Black Hawk raced toward the surrounded battalion, taking fire from multiple directions. Small arms fire cracked past the aircraft. Anti-aircraft artillery created deadly patterns of exploding shells. Ruby flew through it all with aggressive defensive maneuvering, constantly changing altitude, speed, and direction, using terrain features for cover, employing every tactic she'd learned in years of high-threat operations. Another missile launch. Ruby broke left, climbed sharply, dispensed chaff and flares, then dove back toward the ground. The missile lost track and self-destructed. 5 kilometers, Bennett called out. Enemy forces visible ahead. Through the windscreen, Ruby could see the battlefield, a scene of chaos and destruction. The American battalion was established in a defensive circle perhaps 400 meters in diameter, surrounded by enemy forces on all sides. Smoke from burning vehicles rose into the sky. Tracers from both sides created deadly light shows. Explosions erupted continuously as artillery impacted and enemy armor fired into the American position. I'm going straight in, Ruby announced. Fast approach, land in the center of their perimeter, load as many wounded as we can carry, then get out. That's going to be tight. Enemy forces are within small arms range of their perimeter, which means we'll be taking fire the entire time. Keep tracking threats and call them out. Ruby pushed the Black Hawk to maximum speed, diving toward Harrison's position from an angle the enemy wouldn't expect. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around them. Ruby flew through it with precise, aggressive maneuvering that kept the aircraft moving unpredictably. As they approached the American perimeter, Ruby keyed her radio to the battalion frequency. Ironside Actual, this is Night Stalker 7-1 inbound to your position for emergency extraction. Mark your perimeter and prepare wounded for immediate loading. Harrison's voice came back filled with disbelief. Night Stalker 7-1, say again? We were told no air assets available. Ironside Actual, no air assets were authorized. We're here anyway. Mark your perimeter now. Within seconds, colored smoke grenades popped in the center of the American defensive position, marking a landing zone perhaps 50 meters in diameter, barely adequate for a Black Hawk, but it would have to do. Ruby lined up her approach, diving toward the marked landing zone while taking fire from multiple directions. Bullets impacted the Black Hawk's armored fuselage with metallic pings. A piece of the windscreen spiderwebbed from a near miss. Taking hits, Bennett called out. Multiple systems showing damage warnings. We're committed, Ruby said calmly, maintaining her approach despite the increasingly heavy fire. Prepare for hot landing. She brought the Black Hawk down fast and hard, not the smooth professional landing she'd normally execute, but a controlled crash that got them on the ground as quickly as possible to minimize time exposed to enemy fire. The moment the wheels touched down, American soldiers began rushing toward the helicopter with wounded personnel. The crew chief and door gunners opened fire with their mounted machine guns, suppressing enemy positions that had direct sight lines to the landing zone. Ruby kept the engines at high power, ready for immediate takeoff. Through her windscreen, she could see the devastation the battalion had endured: destroyed vehicles, hastily dug fighting positions, wounded soldiers being treated in exposed positions, exhausted troops maintaining defensive fire against overwhelming enemy numbers. Colonel Harrison himself ran to the Black Hawk, his uniform torn and bloody, his face showing exhaustion and stress from 3 hours of desperate combat. He climbed into the cargo compartment where wounded were being loaded and made his way to Ruby's cockpit. Captain, I don't know who authorized this mission, but you just saved a lot of lives. We've got approximately 40 critically wounded who need immediate evacuation. We can fit maybe 12 to 15 on this bird if we pack them in, Ruby called back over the engine noise. Load them up. There's no way you can make multiple trips. The enemy will adjust their fires and shoot you down. Then we'll make as many trips as we can before that happens. Load the wounded. Harrison looked at her for a long moment, then nodded with grim respect. He jumped back out of the Black Hawk and began directing the loading of wounded soldiers. The crew chief called forward. Captain, we're at maximum capacity. 15 wounded loaded. We can't fit more. Ironside Actual, we're loaded, Ruby transmitted. Moving out now. We'll return for more wounded as soon as we can. Harrison's voice came back. Night Stalker 7-1, you are not authorized for multiple trips. Get those wounded back to base and stay there. That's an order from me as the senior officer on this battlefield. Ironside Actual, with respect, I'm already violating orders by being here. Might as well get court-martialed for doing it right. See you in 15 minutes. Ruby pulled collective and lifted the overloaded Black Hawk out of the landing zone. The aircraft was heavy, beyond its rated capacity with 15 wounded soldiers plus crew, and he's sluggish to respond. Enemy fire intensified as they climbed away from the American position. Taking heavy fire, Bennett called out. Multiple hits. A warning light flashed, hydraulic pressure dropping in the aft system. Ruby compensated with increased control inputs as the Black Hawk became harder to fly. Another alarm, engine oil pressure falling on number 2 engine. Number 2 engine compromised, Bennett reported. Recommend shutting it down. Negative. We need both engines to maintain altitude and speed. We'll fly it until it quits. The Black Hawk limped away from the battlefield, trailing smoke from the damaged engine, with Ruby fighting the increasingly unresponsive controls. The 15 wounded soldiers in the cargo compartment were silent, too exhausted or too injured to react to the dramatic extraction. 10 minutes later, minutes filled with tense monitoring of failing systems and decreasing performance, Ruby brought the damaged Black Hawk down at forward operating Base Guardian. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft, pulling wounded soldiers out for immediate treatment. Before Ruby could shut down engines, Colonel Stone appeared at her cockpit door, her expression thunderous. "Captain Phillips, shut down your engines immediately. You are grounded pending disciplinary action." Ruby kept the engines running, completing post-flight checks. "Ma'am, I need to refuel and return to extract more wounded." "You are not returning anywhere. You disobeyed direct orders, conducted an unauthorized flight into hostile territory, and endangered your crew and aircraft against explicit instructions." "You're done flying today, Captain." Ruby looked at Stone directly. "There are 25 more critically wounded soldiers at Harrison's position who will die without evacuation. This Black Hawk can make at least one more trip before maintenance grounds it. Are you going to stop me from saving those soldiers?" "I'm ordering you to shut down these engines right now." Ruby turned to Bennett. "Tyler, you heard the colonel's order. If you want to shut down the engines and end this flight, I'll understand. But if you're willing to continue, I'm going back for more wounded." Bennett didn't hesitate. "We came this far. Let's finish the job." Ruby looked back at Stone. "Ma'am, you can court-martial me when we get back. But right now, I'm returning to that battlefield." She advanced the throttles, preparing to lift off. Stone stared at her for 5 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then she made a decision that would define her own career. "If you're going back anyway, you're not going alone. I'm authorizing a full extraction mission with gunship support, but you're still grounded afterward, Captain. This conversation isn't over." Stone stepped away from the Black Hawk and began shouting orders. "I need 2 Apaches ready for immediate launch. Coordinate with artillery for fire support. We're going to extract that entire battalion before the enemy overruns them." Over the next 2 hours, Ruby flew 3 more trips into Harrison's position, each time loading wounded soldiers while taking heavy enemy fire. Apache gunships provided covering fire, artillery hammered enemy positions, and fixed-wing aircraft finally arrived to suppress the anti-aircraft systems. By the 4th trip, Harrison's battalion had been reinforced by ground forces, fighting their way through the enemy encirclement. The immediate crisis had passed. The battalion would hold until they could be relieved. But those first 15 soldiers Ruby had extracted, they would have died waiting for authorization. The decision to violate orders and fly anyway had saved lives that would have been lost to bureaucracy and caution. When Ruby finally shut down the damaged Black Hawk after her 4th trip, she was physically and mentally exhausted. She'd been flying for 3 straight hours in the most intense combat conditions she'd ever experienced. Her aircraft had sustained significant damage. One engine was barely functional, hydraulics were compromised, and the airframe had taken dozens of hits. Colonel Stone was waiting for her as she climbed out of the aircraft. "Captain Phillips, you're officially relieved of flight duty pending investigation into your actions today. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow to begin formal proceedings." "Yes, ma'am." "Off the record? You saved a lot of lives today, but you also violated fundamental military discipline. I don't know yet whether to recommend you for a medal or a court-martial." "Ma'am, with respect, I don't care which. Those soldiers are alive. That's what matters." 3 days later, Ruby stood at attention in a formal hearing convened to determine what charges, if any, would be filed against her for disobeying orders and conducting an unauthorized combat operation. The hearing officer was Brigadier General Thomas Wade, a career aviator with 30 years of service and a reputation for being strictly by the book. "Captain Phillips," Wade began, "you are here because on the date in question, you deliberately disobeyed direct orders, conducted an unauthorized flight into a designated no-fly zone, endangered your crew and aircraft, and operated outside approved mission parameters. These are serious violations of military discipline. How do you respond?" "Sir, I acknowledge that I disobeyed orders. I conducted an unauthorized flight, put my crew at risk, and violated standing directives. These facts are not in dispute." "Then you understand the severity of your actions?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ruby paused, choosing her words carefully. Sir, I understand that military discipline requires following orders. I understand that those orders exist for valid reasons. But I also understand that 300 American soldiers were going to die unless someone helped them, and I had the capability to help. I made a judgment call that saving lives was more important than following orders that I believed would result in unnecessary deaths. Wade leaned back in his chair. Captain, the military cannot function if every officer decides for themselves which orders to follow based on their personal judgment. What you did sets a dangerous precedent. I agree, sir. If every pilot ignored orders whenever they disagreed, we'd have chaos. But this wasn't about disagreeing with orders. It was about recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond what command understood from their position, and that immediate action was necessary to prevent catastrophic loss of life. That's a convenient rationalization. It's what happened, sir. Command was 20 kilometers away, making decisions based on tactical displays. I was a pilot with specific capabilities monitoring the situation in real time. I had information and perspective they didn't have. Wade pulled out a document. I've read Colonel Harrison's after-action report. He states, and I quote, Captain Phillips' unauthorized extraction flight arrived at the exact moment when my battalion's situation had become critical. Without her intervention, we would have lost at least 40 soldiers to their wounds before authorized extraction could be arranged. Her actions, while technically in violation of orders, were tactically and morally correct given the circumstances we faced. He pulled out another document. I also have a letter signed by all 300 members of Harrison's battalion, thanking you for saving their lives and requesting that you not face disciplinary action. Wade set down the documents and looked at Ruby directly. Here's my dilemma, Captain. By regulations, I should recommend court-martial for your actions. But by any reasonable assessment of outcomes, you made the right decision. You saved lives that would have been lost to excessive caution. He paused, then continued. I'm going to make a recommendation that will probably satisfy no one, but seems appropriate given the circumstances. You will receive a formal letter of reprimand in your service record documenting that you violated orders. That reprimand will likely prevent future promotions in command positions. You've essentially ended your career progression. However, I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. You'll have both the reprimand and the medal in your record, a permanent reminder that you did something brave and necessary that was also against regulations. Wade closed his folder. Captain Phillips, military aviation needs pilots with your skills and courage, but it also needs discipline and order. You've proven you have the former. I hope you'll remember the importance of the latter. Dismissed. 6 months later, Captain Ruby Phillips was still flying Blackhawks for the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, though now everyone knew her as the pilot who ignored orders and saved 300 soldiers. Her career progression had indeed stalled. The letter of reprimand ensured she'd never make major or command a unit, but she had also received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony attended by Colonel Harrison and representatives from the battalion she'd saved. Harrison had personally pinned the medal on her uniform and said simply, "You gave 300 families their loved ones back. Thank you." Ruby continued flying high-risk missions in hostile environments, her skills and experience too valuable to waste despite the disciplinary mark on her record. Other pilots sought her mentorship, wanting to learn from someone who'd proven that sometimes courage means doing what's right even when it violates what's authorized. 1 year after the incident, Ruby was conducting a training session for new Night Stalker pilots. A young pilot raised her hand. "Ma'am, everyone knows the story about you flying into that kill zone against orders. How did you make that decision? How did you know you were doing the right thing?" Ruby considered her answer carefully. "I didn't know for certain I was doing the right thing. I knew that 300 soldiers were going to die without help, and I had a Black Hawk and the skills to help them. I had to choose between following orders and saving lives. When you frame the choice that way, it's not actually difficult. It's just terrifying because of the consequences. But you ended your career progression. Was it worth it? I fly Blackhawks for a living. I get to do what I love every day. I just won't ever command a unit or make general. That's a small price compared to what those 300 soldiers and their families would have lost if I'd followed orders and stayed on the ground." Another pilot asked, "Do you regret violating orders?" "I regret that I had to violate orders to save lives. I wish the system had been flexible enough to authorize what needed to be done in the time frame it needed to happen. But no, I don't regret my actual decision. Those soldiers deserved a pilot willing to risk everything to bring them home. That's what we're here for." 300 soldiers had been surrounded deep in enemy territory, outnumbered 7-1, running out of ammunition and facing imminent annihilation, while command refused to authorize air support due to heavy anti-aircraft threats, making extraction too dangerous. Captain Ruby Phillips made a choice that day. She climbed into her Black Hawk, ignored explicit orders to stay grounded, and flew straight into that kill zone, because sometimes following the rules means watching good soldiers die when you have the power to save them. She took fire from all directions, survived multiple missile attacks, and extracted 15 critically wounded soldiers who would have died waiting for authorized support. Her career advancement ended that day, terminated by the letter of reprimand that went in her file. But 300 soldiers went home to their families instead of dying on a foreign battlefield, and Ruby accepted that trade without hesitation or regret, because some responsibilities outweigh regulations, and sometimes courage means doing what's right even when everyone tells you it's wrong. Thanks for watching. Every woman has a story worth telling. Join us to hear them all.